but they never looked at the firm because they're very understaffed, so they can only look about 10% of these investment advisors. So I think, there was already a lot of talk of maybe, the SEC doesn't survive, when we finally do this regulatory overhaul that most people think is inevitable after the financial crisis. At the very least, you have to look at, the staffing issue, all these loopholes that investment advisors and hedge funds have in terms of how loosely regulated they are. Those sorts of things are definitely going to be.
Well, Paul Keel, I want to thank you for being with us, reporter with ProPublica, news investigative website, and Robert Crane, the president of the Jet Foundation, which is now closing its doors. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll be joined by Professor, UN Envoy Richard Falk. He's just been detained and deported from Israel as he tried to get into Gaza. We'll talk to him. Stay with us.
ويصلي لإله في العيون العسلية بين ردة وعيوني بندقية والذي يعرف ردة ينحني ويصلي لإله في العيون العسلية. قبلت ردة عندما كانت صغيرة وأنا أذكر كيف التصقت بي وغطت سعيدي أحلى ضفيرة وأنا قبلت ردة عندما كانت صغيرة.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations Human Rights Chief Navi Pillay accused Israel Tuesday of, quote, unprecedented and deeply regrettable treatment of UN human rights investigator Richard Falk. Falk was deported from Israel Monday after being detained at Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport for 20 hours. He was appointed the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories earlier this year, but was denied entry because of what Israel called his, quote, highly politicized views. Israeli Foreign Ministry spokesperson Yigal Palmor said Falk, quote, does not try to advance human rights, but instead comes with his conclusions ready, and those conclusions are, of course, extreme, methodic criticism of Israel and only of Israel, he said. Israel's Foreign Ministry also accused Falk of, quote, legitimizing Hamas terrorism and drawing shameful comparisons to the Holocaust. The professor emeritus of international law at Princeton University, Richard Falk, issued a statement last week titled Gaza, Silence is Not an Option, that condemned Israel's blockade of Gaza as a, quote, flagrant and massive violation of international humanitarian law. He urged the UN to invoke the agreed norm of responsibility to protect a civilian population being collectively punished by policies that amount to a crime against humanity. Falk also called for an international criminal court investigation of Israeli military and civilian officials for potential prosecution. Richard Falk is now back at home in California. He joins me now on the telephone. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Professor Falk. Talk about what happened. When did you try to get into Israel and Gaza?
Amy, it was about 3 days ago, and I came with a security person and an assistant from Geneva. They had received visas ensuring them entry, which were honored when we arrived at Ben Gurion Airport. And because they received visas and knew that I was coming, we assumed there'd be no problem with my entry because they had ample indication, in fact, formal notification of my itinerary. So it remains strange why they didn't either inform Geneva, where the human rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights is located, or just deny them visas, which would have been a signal of their intention. So somehow or other, it appears that they wanted this incident to occur. And when I arrived, they questioned me first in the passport area, and then led me after long delays from one place to another until the representative of the Ministry of Interior denied me entry and placed me in this detention facility prior to being expelled on the plane that took me back here to California.
And in that 20-hour period, were they questioning you?
No, they didn't. Oddly, again, they didn't seem particularly interested in either exploring my views or objecting to them or doing anything substantive. They just put me in this detention facility, which is located, I think, on the periphery of the airport area, and is a very coercive little experience, because I was in with 5 other people in a tiny room where there was barely space to stand, and it was we were locked in this room and treated not terribly, but unpleasantly, I would put it that way. The others were there for technical infractions of immigration law of one reason or another, and most of them were waiting for lawyers. Actually, we had good camaraderie, so that was one of the sort of pleasant aspects of a generally unpleasant experience.
Can you talk about what your plan was in getting into Gaza and your response to the Israeli Foreign Ministry spokesperson Yigal Palmor saying that you don't try to advance human rights, but instead comes with his conclusions ready, and those conclusions are, of course, extreme, methodic criticism of Israel and only of Israel, and the Israel Foreign Ministry also accusing you of legitimizing Hamas terrorism and drawing shameful comparisons to the Holocaust?
Well, I think they're all, first of all, distortions of my real views, and secondly, part of a much wider and what I would regard as insidious pattern of trying to shift the attention from their objections to the person rather than their argument with the facts that are the basis of mine or other people's assessment of the situation. I think I could stand very well behind the views that are contained in my report and would gladly engage in any kind of discussion of those views. But Israel has been pursuing what I call a politics of opaqueness, trying to make the realities of the occupation as obscure as possible and as speculative as possible. They've kept those who are knowledgeable inside Gaza from leaving to attend international conferences. Rajni Sarani, for instance, the head of the Human Rights Center, who had previously been allowed to attend international conferences and is a distinguished recipient of the Kennedy Center's Human Rights Award. So they've tried to keep people in who know something about the reality of the occupation, and then try to keep people out, such as myself, who could report credibly on what is happening inside, and shifting that argument then to my qualifications. Let me come to these issues